In this video, we will dive into creating real application using Angular and NgRx with newest features like standalone components or create feature inside NgRx. And this video is a part of my full course Angular and NgRx building real project from scratch. This is why if you want to get a full course, don't forget to check a link in the description box below. But if you just want to start with the basics, let's jump right into it. Welcome to my course Angular and NgRx building real projects from scratch. And in this course we will use these two technologies to build a real production application. We will start with the empty folder and finish with a fully functional application. We will create most typical features of every project, like for example authentication, pagination, fetching data from API, liking and disliking articles, implementing feed, and much more. We will use Angular together with NgRx, which is the most popular solution to build scalable applications and manage state on the frontend. Obviously, all our code will be dry, reusable, easy to understand, and fully covered with Typescript. By the end of this course, you will for sure be able to create your own Angular projects of any complexity. Who am I? My name is Alexander Kocherhin and I am a web developer with more than 10 years of experience, as well as a professional instructor with various courses regarding web technologies. I did my best to put all my knowledge inside this course and I want to share it with you. So welcome on board and let's get started. In this video we will install everything that we need in order to create our Angular application. And here we must start with installing Node.js on your machine, and as you can see I am on the website nodejs.org, and here we have two versions, LTS version 18 and current version 19. And actually I always recommend my students to install LTS version. It supports everything that you need, but it is much more stable. This is why you can simply download an archive here and install it like any application on your machine. After installation, in order to test that you installed successfully Node.js on your machine, you can write node -v or -- version. As you can see here, I am getting version 16, so I have a Node version which is a little bit older than here, but still Angular will work with any version quite fine if it is at least 14 or bigger. Which actually means Node 16 is fine, 18 and 19 are also fine. So after you successfully installed Node.js on your machine, we must install Angular CLI to create an Angular project. What is Angular CLI? This is a terminal tool which allows us to do some Angular commands. And the most popular command here is generate new Angular project with the whole folder structure. And as you can see here, the recommended version is to install it with npm install globally Angular CLI. And we can do that because we already installed Node and we have npm together with it. And after this we have ng inside terminal and we can use like nghelp, nggenerate, or for example generate a new project with ng new and the name of the project. This is totally fine, you can install Angular CLI like this, but I really like another method. Why that? Because it is more flexible. I like to use it like this, npx, and you also have npx if you installed Node.js on your machine, and here we can provide -p and then add Angular /CLI 15. And as you understand here, we are defining what command we want to use. And here we say, okay, I really want to install this package, which is Angular CLI 15. This is exactly this stuff, but we will always use it through this npx command. So it will never be global like here ng and then some command. We will always use it like this with ng and then here will be a command. For example, generate environments like you can see here. What is the point of using command like this? In this case, we can easily switch to any version of Angular that you need, because here we're defining what exactly CLI version we want to use. Let's say tomorrow Angular 16 or 17 is coming out, you don't need to have any hassle with reinstalling Angular CLI, which will be global on your machine. You can simply write npx -p Angular CLI version 17 ng and you're good to go. This is why here I can write ng -- version, and I'm getting here a question, do I really want to install this package? I'm hitting here yes, and I'm waiting for its installation. As you can see here, we're getting an error, you need to specify a command before moving on, and we can use --help. So here we have ng-help, but actually ng-version command does not exist. We can write here ng-version, and then it will work just fine. As you can see here that we have a version Angular CLI 15, we have Node 16, this is what I have installed, and these are our packages. So our next step here will be to generate our Angular project, and as you can see here, the command is ng-new and the name of the project. So in my case here, it will be just ng, then new, and here is the name. And as we're implementing a clone of Medium, let's name it medium clone _ Angular. I'm hitting here enter and we're getting some questions. Do we want to add Angular routing? Yes, sure, we need that. What style sheet format we want to use? I will take here CSS because it doesn't really matter. We won't write any CSS at all. We will take already existing CSS and use already existing API. And our full focus will be on learning Angular. As you can see here, all packages were installed successfully. At the end, I'm getting a hint regarding a master branch, but it is not interesting for us at all. But now what we can do, we can jump inside medium clone Angular, and as you can see here are all files that were generated. And here we have all our files, and inside our package.json we can see what command we must use in order to start our project. This is why here will be npm run start, and we're good to go. As you can see, we didn't get any errors, and we can open now our project on localhost 4200. And here is how it looks in browser. We have here a top bar and some content regarding documentation and what to do next. Which means our project was generated just fine, but we must clean the whole project because we need all that stuff that you can see here. This is why let's jump inside our project, and here I want to open source app, and here we have quite a lot of files, like routing, component CSS, HTML spec, and we don't need a lot of that. For example, here I want to remove app component spec completely, because we don't need it. Also, we don't need app component CSS, but now we must jump inside app component TS, and here remove our style URLs, because we removed the CSS file. Also, we don't need here this title, so let's remove this, and let's jump inside our app component HTML. As you can see here, we have lots of styles and lots of markup. I really want to remove everything except of the last line. And the last line is router outlet. This is exactly where all our routing will be rendered. We will talk about it later. What we can do here on the top, we can create just a simple div and write inside app is running, so we can see that we are clean. Let's check if it's working. I am reloading the page and we are getting app is running, which means we successfully cleaned our application. But it is still not enough. As you can see here, we have app module and app component. And if you don't know, inside Angular, we have two different ways of creating projects. Previously, we always have just modules and components. This is why here we have app module and app component. And if we are creating new feature, you will typically create some module, for example, auth module, and then you will render inside some components, maybe register component or login component. But not so long ago, inside Angular, standalone components were introduced. What does it mean? Now modules and modules are optional, which actually means we can create new features just with components without using modules. And it takes much less code to create features. This is why we will fully omit modules that were previously inside Angular and just create the whole project with standalone components. Which brings us back to our project. Our project is still generated with ng modules in mind. This is why here we have this app module where we have a declaration of app component. But what we want to do now, we want to remove app module completely because we don't want to have any modules inside our application. Instead, we will have two different things. First of all, we must update our main TS, because here we used Platform Browser Dynamic Bootstrap module. This is exactly what we used previously to create an application and provide here app module. But now we're creating things differently with standalone components. So I want to remove everything from here and write Bootstrap application. And as you can see now, we're providing root component inside and not a module. And our root component will be our app component. And as a second parameter, we will provide a lot of options, but most often we will provide here just providers. I will leave it as an empty array, and we will write lots of stuff here later. Our next step will be to update our app component. So I'm jumping inside source app, and here we have app component. This is totally fine, but to make it standalone, we must add just a single property, which is called standalone, and we must set it to true. Now this component can exist without a module. This is exactly the purpose. As you can see here inside console, we are getting an error. Inside app component HTML, we used router outlet. Just to remind, here inside HTML, we left router outlet. And we are getting an error that this element is not included and Angular doesn't know what is it. This is why in order to fix it, we must jump back inside app component yes, and here we're adding imports. And inside an array, we just create router outlet. As you can see now, we don't have any errors inside console because we injected here router outlet. And if you worked with Angular previously, you can remember that we have modules and components, and inside modules we defined imports. There were all our dependencies of the module. Now we have the standalone components which are playing the same role. Standalone component is simply a mix of module and component. This is why here we're writing some stuff which is related to component, but we also write imports which were related previously to the module, which actually means we're writing all dependencies of our component inside imports property. And in this case here, it is just router outlet. As you can see in browser, we don't have any errors and our application is still running, but now it is fully prepared to start developing in the new Angular way. In this video, you will learn why we must choose NgRx for our project as a state management tool. I'm sorry for interruption, but I just want to let you know that I have lots of advanced courses on different web technologies where we create real applications and prepare for the interviews. You can find the link in the description box below. And just to remind you, inside Angular, we doesn't have a lot of things to manage our state. We have just components or we have services if we want to share some stuff between the services. For example, here in the official Angular IO, we can see the example of hero service. We can store there some variables, we can inject inside different things, and we can create methods that we can use from any place just because our service is shareable. The main problem here is that all our services don't have any strict rules what we are writing inside or how they are working, which essentially means all our Angular code is just some properties inside components, some properties or methods inside services, and then somehow we're reusing this stuff across the application. It is not scalable, it is not suitable for a big team, and it is really hard to develop Angular project of medium or large size this way. This is why we have a solution which is called Redux, and this is a predictable state container for JavaScript applications. It is not super clear line, but essentially this is a global state of data which is outside of your framework, and you can just in a strict way use it. It is suitable for any framework like React, Angular or Vue, doesn't matter what, even plain JavaScript would go, and it is extremely popular nowadays, and essentially every single framework we're using with it. But inside Angular we are not using Redux directly as it is, we're using NgRx. Here is an official website, ngrx.io, and this is just a wrapper around Redux to implement it correctly for Angular. It simplifies our life a lot, and it is implementing Redux in Angular way. So here essentially is everything that you need to know regarding NgRx. It is a framework or a bunch of libraries to build reactive applications in Angular. We can create global state, local state, we can make side effects with clear component architecture, we have entity collection manager, it works with Angular router, and we can easily debug our state. Which actually means NgRx is a must for medium or huge applications. But actually previously I got lots of comments, I don't need NgRx, I'm quite fine with just components and services, I can just call HTTP and it works. You're totally fine and it will work if you're working alone on a small project, but for teams of several people it is not that suitable, and if we're talking about big companies where you want to hire new people which must understand Angular and obviously your state management, it is much easier to work if everything is strict and is written in the same way. The main problem with Redux and NgRx, it is quite a lot of boilerplate to write, but it is a price that you must pay in order to get all its benefits. In this video I want to talk about project structure for our application. So what we're implementing here is a project which is called Real World, and you can see it here on the GitHub, go thanks to Real World. The main idea is that people are building the same projects with different technologies. On the backend and on the frontend, they are using different frameworks. And here we get out-of-the-box prepared CSS files, and we're just focusing on building our project with Angular. The most important page for us here is an API spec. We can open it and check. Here on the left you can see different endpoints that we can use in order to communicate with already prepared for us API on the public server. And we will talk about API in the later videos, but here you can see some requests. For example, we will do a request to login a user with /API users login, and this is our body. So if you don't know what format to provide or what you will get back, here it is all written down. The response formats, error handling, and all that we need. Additionally to that, here is the project. We are on the example of the project Angular Real World.io. And here, first of all, we see global feed. This is the list of our items. Here we have pagination on the bottom. We can jump between pages. We have popular tags on the right. These are predefined tags. They are not tags that you can create yourself. Here we can click on some popular tags and get in this section. Additionally to that, we can like a post. We can jump inside this post to check it. We can also create a new post here. We can click new article, provide some information, and if we don't provide information, then we get some error messages, and our article was created. So we have lots of features like in real project, for example, registration, login, authenticating of the user with local storage token, making API requests, routing, creating feed, creating pagination, liking, disliking articles, and much more. The question is how we can organize all this stuff correctly to make it scalable. And here let's try to define our structure on a basic level so it will be easier to understand how we will accomplish everything. First of all, we have main TS, this is our entry point. And we also have an app folder. And I mark all folders with / so you can understand it better. If we're implementing some feature, for example, a global feed, then here will be /global feed folder. You can name it a feature folder, a module folder, but essentially this is some component which is going together with routing. And inside here we will have global feed.routes. And it is important to understand. Previously, inside Angular, we had modules, and the entry point in our feature or module was always module, so global feed.module. And then additionally here we will create a folder with components, and here we will render all components that we need. But here we're creating standalone components, and we want to make all our routes lazy loaded. This is why here we will define global feed routes. And just from the beginning, I want to tell you, if you don't understand everything that I'm telling you in this video, this is totally fine. You can later return when you progress with the course and check if you understood everything correctly. So we created here a global feed feature. Here is our global feed routes. And here inside we can generate some components. For example, here we create a component global feed. And we can create here more components if we need to. Now let's say that we want to create a single article page. This is by here we will create an article folder, and here we must define article.routes because we are writing everything in the same way. Now inside here we will have components just like inside global feed. But additionally here we may have a store folder, and this is a part which is related to NgRx. It may be possible that we have just a feature with components without store, and it may be more complex with the store inside. And here on the bottom we will have app routes, which will manage all our routes across the application. And here we can create as many features as we want. But additionally to that, we want to share some stuff between different features. This is why here we will create shared. And here we can create something which is shareable. For example, let's say between different features we have a shared data type. Then here we will create a types folder and create here a type, for example, article.interface.ts. And additionally here we can create inside article also types, and then here we put all our types which are not shared, they are just used inside our article. And the same goes with services. For example, here are some shareable services and maybe article.service.ts. But if we have some services which are not shareable, then here we will create services folder and we can put any service that we want here, for example, article.service.ts. This service won't be shareable, this service will be shareable because it is in shared folder. Additionally to that, we will have a shareable components. This is why here inside shared, we're creating components. So for example, here we can say that we have a backend error messages component. And what does it mean? This is just a component, so backend error messages.component.ts and also HTML. The entry point inside this backend error messages is not a route, it is a component. Why is that? Because it is shareable. It is not tied to the route like features here. These features can't exist without routing. They can be initialized only through the routing. But additionally to that, we can create our component more complex. For example, let's say we have a shareable component popular tags, and here we can define popular tags.component.ts, but also we can define here types, which are not shareable, they are just for popular tags, then /store, this is NgRx for popular tags, and maybe services, which are services for popular tags. So this structure is extremely flexible for medium and even large applications. And this is exactly what we will use inside this course. In this video you will learn what is Prettier and why do you need to install it at all. And actually Prettier is not a mandatory tool to start developing Angular application, but this is a tool that I am using more than 5 years already and it simplifies writing code a lot. So what is Prettier? As you can see here on the official website, this is an opinionated code formatter, which essentially means you simply install it, you almost can't configure it, and you are getting prettified code out of the box every single time when you are saving your file. Which actually means you don't spend time to intend your code, you simply write it how you know it, and then you just click Command S and the whole code is prettified. It is even more important when you are working with several developers and you want to see the code in the same way. And here is a playground on the website. You can see on the left not prettified code and on the right prettified code. And obviously it is much easier to read. Now the question is how to install Prettier. You must install it together with your editor. I highly recommend you, if you don't have a preferable editor, to use VS Code or Visual Studio Code. This is the most popular editor in the world for writing JavaScript and Typescript. And there you can install a plugin which is called Prettier and it will prettify your code automatically. I am not using VS Code myself but Vim, but I also installed Prettier plugin. What we want to do now, we want to create a configuration file for Prettier. This is why in the root of our folder I am creating .prettierrc. And inside I am pasting such config. As you can see, this is the object. Tab width means that we want to intend our code with 2 spaces at the beginning. Single quote means that all our strings will be written in a single quote and not in double quotes. Print width is the maximum width on the screen after which your code will be intended. 80 is a default preference to make it readable on a smaller screens. Bracket spacing false means that you won't have spacing inside the object. And the last one is semi-false, which means semicolon false. I prefer in my projects to not use semicolon at the end of every single line, it makes code more readable. But if you want to put semicolons, this is totally fine, simply change this configuration to true and you're good to go. Now let's have a look how Prettier is working. I want to jump in source app, and here we have our app component. As you can see, the whole code is already intended, but here we have, for example, spaces inside our objects. I'm just saving this file, and as you can see, these spaces are gone. Now our objects don't have spaces. Additionally to that, if I will break an indentation inside my file, and for example here inside array, and then after this just save a file, as you can see, voila, everything is nicely intended, and we don't need to spend time on indentation. In this video, I want to talk about language server. What does it mean? Essentially, when we are writing Angular, we are writing Typescript, and it is not comfortable to work with Typescript without auto imports, autocomplete, and type checking. This is why, in order to have all this stuff, you must have a language server. If you are using my recommendation and your editor is VS Code, which you can see here, you have auto import and autocomplete and checking of the typings out of the box. You don't even need to install anything. But if you have some other editor, then you must install some plugin, which is typically called like Typescript server or maybe language server for Typescript, in order to bring this support to your editor. And this is how it looks like. As you can see here, I am back inside app component TS, and let's say that we're removing here import app component, and we just wrote component. As you can see, this red message is exactly the error from language server, which actually means language server is just a TypeScript server which is running additionally for our project, and it shows all messages for us inside the editor. In this case here, we are getting cannot find name component. Did you mean app component? Obviously we didn't, but what we want to do, we want to auto import here component on the top. And it is extremely useful because we will import lots and lots of stuff. We don't want to type every single import by hands, because in this case we must remember from what package this import is coming. Is it really Angular core, or is it Angular router, or something different? In case with auto import you don't have such problem. Secondly is obviously autocomplete. If we don't have here import and I'm just typing here component, I am getting a huge autocomplete list. But what I can do, I can select some stuff here and highlight it. For example, here I am selecting component, I didn't hit enter, but on the right you can see the description, what is component, from what package it is coming, and what it does. And it helps tremendously during development. So here I'm hitting enter again, and we're getting this autocomplete. And the last thing that we want to use from Typescript server is type checking, which actually means here we can hover on the component and check what it does. And as you can see here, we see that this is a component and how it works. If we will define here a variable, for example, foo, which is a foo inside our app component, you can also highlight here our property, and we see that this is a property foo inside our app component, and the data type is string. This is also extremely important to know with what types you are working and why you get some error. In this video, I want to talk about our API. And as I already told you, we are using real-world project. And the main idea is that inside we already get an API and CSS, which means we won't spend any time on implementing this stuff. As you can see here, I opened the link https api.realworld.io/api/articles, and here query parameters limit and offset. And we are getting back a list of articles in the format which is specified inside real-world.io. The main point is that this is a public API which we will use for the whole application. But here are some problems with public API which my students had. First of all, the list of the posts is being cleaned every single day. But even until we implement something inside our application, you can simply jump to any public project, like for example angular.realworld.io, and here you can sign up to create a new user, and after this you can create, for example, a post. Or maybe you need to follow some other user, you can simply jump here, click on the user and follow this user. This is totally doable until we will implement this functionality in our project. Another problem that a lot of students have, they tried to register some email, but it was already taken. Inside this public API, they don't check your emails, which actually means verification is not needed. This is why any person can type any email, and obviously when you will try to use your email, it may be taken. This is completely normal. You can just take any email that you want and it will work. And the last problem, which is the biggest, sometimes this public API is down, which actually can happen because lots of different projects are using this API and sometimes it just returns 500 or it is too slow or there is some problem. But obviously you should not be stopped to do this course. This is why you can set up this API locally. Obviously this is more difficult than just use API real-world.io directly, which is a public API, but it is certainly doable because I prepared all files for you. So first of all, you must take an archive under this video. There you have an additional repository with the API. This is exactly this API that here we're getting as a public API. The second step that you must do, you must install on your machine Docker Desktop. And if you think now, okay, but it is really getting complicated, I don't know what is Docker, this is totally fine. It is just the easiest way to isolate project on your machine and make sure that it will run smoothly without any problems. Before Docker, lots of students had problems with installations, with different dependencies, but after Docker, everything is running smoothly. So here you just need to install Docker Desktop. It is working on any operational system, and this is how it looks like when it is running. The most important part here, it must be green on the left. It means that your Docker is working, and here obviously you will have the empty list and not like my list. So here is the project that you must download from the source code of this video if you want to set up a local API. Obviously, you only need to set up a local API if you have some problems with public API and you can't proceed with the course. So here is this repository, and we just need to run two commands. First of all, docker -compose build, and this command docker compose is available for you after you install Docker Desktop. I'm hitting here enter and I must wait until Docker downloads all dependencies and prepares the container. As you can see, everything is finished, and now we must run one more command, which is docker compose, not build but up. And it will be a hanging process of your API and you should not stop it, which actually means you must run your API in parallel with developing frontend. As you can see here, we're getting an answer that everything is started and our server is there. This is why here inside browser you can open now localhost 3000/API/articles, and we're getting here a list of articles which were generated for us. And the whole API is exactly the same API like the public API, and you can use it if something is not working inside public API. And the last thing that I want to tell you before we will start implementing our project is the importance of strict rules. As you can see here inside our project, we have tsconfig.json and we have lots of different rules here. The most important rule here is strict true. It makes our Typescript stricter, and this is a good thing because you will find problems in transpiling time and not in runtime or in production running website. Additionally to that, you can disable quite a lot of stuff if it will go after strict true. Actually, strict true is a group of rules which makes your application strict, and you can disable every single rule. Obviously, I highly recommend you to never disable these rules because it doesn't make any sense. Typically, beginner developers just lacking the knowledge to fix their TypeScript problem, and then they simply disable the error. But it won't fix your problem if you will just disable the error. You will simply not see the error and your website will kind of work, but then at some point you will have a problem, which actually means strict false is bad. Disabling of strict rules is also bad. Using TypeScript with any is also bad if you are writing it all over the place. You should never fix your TypeScript code just by removing the data type and referring to it as any. Then your TypeScript won't be bulletproof like it was before. It will be just like a house with holes in it. In this video, we start implementing our project, and first of all we will do a register page. What is it? As you can see here, I can jump inside Angular real-world.io/register, and this is how our page will look like. So we have standard markup with 3 inputs: username, email, password. As you can see, the button is disabled, but if we will type something, doesn't matter if it is correct or not, we will just sign up. If, for example, email is already registered or username is already used, we will get here validation on the top. As you can see here, I clicked sign up and I'm getting a message username has already been taken. So let's change this out, click sign up, and now we're redirected inside our feed and we're logged in. So the goal of this video is to create our register component and bind the router correctly. And in order to do that, I want to remind you how we structure our application. Inside source app, we have just an app component. Here we want to create a register page, which essentially means we're creating a new feature. We could create just a register folder here, but later we will also have login and a lot of stuff which is related to the current user, like for example authentication, are we authorized or not, logout, and much more. This is why here I want to register a new feature auth, where inside we will create everything. So here I want to create new folder auth, and inside I want to create auth.routes.ts. And just to remind you, auth routes is an entry point to access register and login page. Why is that? Because essentially our features can't exist without a route. Now inside our app route, I want to create new folder and name it components. This is where all our components which are related to auth feature will be situated. And in our case, it is register and later login. This is why here I want to create new folder register, and inside we just need 2 files, register.component.ts and register.component.html. So let's write inside HTML file just register page without any markup, so we can check if it's working at all. Now inside our register component, we want to register a new component decorator, and we must provide inside first of all our selector. And actually here you typically would write something like register, but actually it makes a lot of sense to prefix all our components somehow uniquely. Because if you are using some library, maybe material, then you will get ML prefix inside your application. And to distinguish easily between different libraries and your own components, it makes a lot of sense to prefix all your selectors. And we're creating the project which is named medium clone. This is why all my prefixes will be MC dash and then the name of the selector. In this case we can see, okay, we have MC prefix, this is our own selector. After this, we must provide here template URL, which we just created, and it is register component HTML. And here we can export our new class, which is a register component. But it is not all, we must in every single component write property standalone true. Why is that? Because we want to use all our components without modules. So we successfully created our component, now we must register it inside our auth routes. This is why here what I want to do, I want to export our register routes. And in our case, we will have just a single route, but it may happen that your application is bigger and then you have more than one route. And actually here I want to export 2 things, register routes and login routes later. But for now we have just register routes. And what is this? This is a route array. This is why here we are creating an array, and inside we want to register just a single object. And here I want to provide path, empty string, and here a component. In our case, it will be register component. Now you might ask, okay, does this make any sense? Why the path here is an empty string? Why it is not register? And actually this register route is our local isolated inside our feature routing. This is not lazy loaded routing, this is exactly what we want to load for our lazy loaded routing. But our routing will be specified inside app routes.ts. This is why we must create now app routes.ts, and they will be inside source app, and here we are creating app routes.ts. As you can see, previously we had app routing module.ts. I will remove this file completely, we don't need it anymore. This is our only source of truth where we're registering all our routes. What we want to do here, we want just to export our app routes, and this is our route array. And here inside we're providing exactly objects with our pages. And in our case here we will create a path register, and here now we want to use load children, not a component, but load children. Why that? Load children means that we want to lazy load it. So load children is a property, and here we must return a function. And here we are using word import, and inside we must provide a lazy loaded path. In our case it is source app, here we have auth, and then auth routes. But inside here we want to resolve correct routes after we loaded it. This is why here then, and essentially we are getting a module back, and we can read m.register routes. What this line is doing, we are saying, okay, we want to lazy load this auth routes. And in our case, our routes is like previously we had a module. And inside this auth route, we are reading register routes that we just created. Just to remind you here, the path is empty because here we specified a path outside. And this code must load for us register route. Let's check this out. We must jump inside main.ts, and as you can see here we have providers, but we didn't use routes at all. So what we want to write inside providers is provide router. And inside we want to provide our app routes that we just created, which actually means this code will load our app routes, and after this app routes we'll lazy load all our links. As you can see here we don't have any errors, so let's check it in browser. Here we are in app running, everything is fine, but I want to write here /register. And as you can see here, we still have app is running, this is our layout, but also we can see here register page. This is exactly the text that we wrote here inside register component, which actually means our register page is successfully loaded, and what is more important, it is lazy loaded. Here inside network, we can check exactly that. As you can see, I am here again on the home page, and I'm clicking on register link. And here what was loaded is this file source app auth routes, and this is exactly our routing where inside everything is bundled only in this file, which actually means lazy loading out of the box helps us to split our application and make every single chunk smaller and our application faster. In this video we will implement markup for our register page. I'm sorry for interruption, but I just wanted to let you know that only 20% of the people who watch my videos are subscribed to the channel. If you really want to continue getting videos and support my channel, consider subscribing. It helps a lot. And as you can see here, I am again on Angular real-world.io/register, and here inside you can see all the elements of this page. So we have class like auth page, container page, row, and so on and so on. And essentially these are all prepared classes and prepared markup, so we're focusing on the framework like Angular and not on writing markup or CSS. And a lot of students asked me why the CSS and HTML are not written in a perfect way, because we are getting it out of the box and we are not creating it from scratch. With that being said, let's create markup for our register page. This is why I'm jumping inside app, auth, components register, register component TS. Here we don't need this text, but we're starting with div class auth page. Then inside we're creating div with class container space page. After this we have a div with class row, and inside row we have div with class column md6, offset md3, and column xs12. This is exactly our centered form. Now here we must create h1 tag with class text xs center, and inside I am writing sign up. After our h1 we have a p tag with class text xs center, and here inside we have a link to our login page. This is why here will be a router link /login, and inside we will write have an account. After our p tag we must render our validation errors, but we didn't implement them yet. This is why I will simply write backend errors here, and later in exactly this place we will add them. After our backend errors we must create our form, and inside the form for every single input we have a field set with class form group. Let's close this field set, and inside we will have an input with type text and class form control and form control large. Additionally to that we have a placeholder, which is a username. So this is exactly one field. Now I want to copy paste it twice because we also need not only username but email and password. This is why the second field set will have a placeholder email, and the last one here will be password. But it is not enough, the type here must also be password. After all our field sets, we want to create a submit button. And here the type will be submit, and the class will be button, button large, button primary, and pull access right. And inside this button we will write sign up. As you can see in browser, our markup is there, but we don't have any CSS. And this is totally normal because we didn't add CSS to our project. In order to fix that, I want to jump inside source, and here we have index.html. And here on the top, in our head, I want to paste these three links. As you can see here, first of all, we have a link for demo production ready.io/main CSS. This is the whole CSS for this project. Secondly, we're adding here icon font to have nice icons inside our application. And the last one here is the font, which is Titilium, and this is the font which is used inside CSS of this project. As you can see now in browser, it looks completely different. We're getting all the styles, and we're getting exactly the same form like you saw inside Angular real-world.io. So our markup is ready, but now I want to create a form for our registration. This is why let's jump back inside app auth components register component ts, and here what I want to do, I want to use reactive forms in order to create a form. And if you don't know, reactive forms is the best possible variant to create forms inside Angular. But in order to create a form, we must inject inside this component form builder. This is why here inside constructor we're defining our form builder or FB, and this is our form builder. Now here on the top I want to create our form, and here we can use this .fb.nonnullable, which means all our fields inside form will always be defined, .group, and here inside we must provide all our controls. In our case it will be first of all username, and this is an empty string. After this we have an email, it is also an empty string, and the last one is password, it is also an empty string. This is totally fine, but we can do better. Why that? Because actually inside reactive forms we're getting client validation. And actually here, instead of just a string, we can set some validation rules for this field. This is why here I'm providing an array, and initial value of the username will be an empty string, but as a second parameter I will write here validators dot, and here we have lots of different validators. I want to use here required, just like this, and this is totally enough. In this case here we're saying, okay, username field is required. Now we're doing exactly the same for email and password. Now let's bind this form to our markup. This is why here inside our HTML we have a form, and here we want to use form group. And here inside form group we're providing our form. But it is not all, we also must create here on submit. This is why here ng-submit, and here will be our function on submit, which will be triggered when we are submitting our form. So let's create here inside our TS file a new function on submit, and what I want to do inside, I want just to console log the value of our form. This is why here let's write form, and we want to read here this form get raw value. But it is not all, we must bind every single input to this object. This is why here we must jump inside our markup, and for the first input I will write here form control name, and here we will have username. And exactly the same we must do for every single field. In this case here it will be an email, and here it will be password. So now all our inputs are binded correctly to our form. We created this submit function, which means we should not get any errors, but we're getting them. We're getting an error cannot bind to form group since it is not a known property of form. And it happens because we didn't import here reactive forms, and form group does not exist here. This is why we must define imports inside our register, and here is our reactive forms module. As you can see here the error is gone. Let's look in browser. Here is our form. Now let's try to write something inside this form. I will type something in all three fields and hit sign up. As you can see here inside console, we're getting our form and all these values, which actually means we successfully wrote markup for our register page, and also we created a form and binded it to all our inputs, and we can read the value from the form. In this video we will install and configure NgRx. As you can see here, I opened the official website of NgRx, and now the main question, is it really worth it to use NgRx when we have in Angular things like component, HTTP, service? Why do we need an additional library? And actually the most basic code that you would write inside register component to register a user is something like this. This .http, then maybe this is a post request on some /register URL, and you are providing inside this form.getRawValue. And after this you are using subscribe to make something when your request is successful. Why this code is problematic? First of all, it is super low level, we are just using HTTP directly inside our component, which means this request is tightly binded to our register component, we can't reuse it in other places. This is why typically we are using services inside Angular. And we can write here not this HTTP post, but maybe just this .register service, and we are providing inside our form value. This is totally fine and this is shareable, but the main problem with services is that they are still low level. What is service? This is just some object with properties and different methods. And all developers can write it differently, which actually means you don't have a solid structure, you don't really know how all this data are working together. You are just throw inside your services a bunch of functions, a bunch of properties, and you are just reusing them everywhere. What we are getting from Redux or NgRx, we are getting a strict structure of how all this stuff is working together. Additionally to that, we are getting all our data in a single global place, which we can always see and debug with ease. So let's look on this diagram. Sure, it is looking difficult, but let's start with the component. So here we are inside our register component, and when we want to do some changes, for example, user submitted our form, we typically want to trigger an action, which actually means action is exactly what is happening. This is one of the terms of NgRx. What action does, it changes the state, and this reducer and store is exactly our global state. And when our state is changed, then all our components who are subscribed to this state will be notified about state changes. This is this part. If you don't understand it fully, don't worry, you will see it on the real example. This is the synchronous part. We didn't talk about API at all, but essentially our register action is an API call. This is why we are getting here to effects and service, and this service will trigger an API call to the API in a strict way, which actually means we are using NgRx to have a strict way of implementing things. And as you can see here on the left, we have a lot of different libraries, like NgRx store, effect, router store, and so on and so on. The core library is NgRx store, and this is exactly what we want to install. This is why I want to jump inside console and write here npm install NgRx store, and I'm hitting enter. So our package is successfully installed. Now let's look on the documentation. Here inside architecture of NgRx we have actions, and you already know what is action. This is something what happened. For example, user started a registration process, and as you can see here the action interface is just a type inside, which means this is just a string with some name, like maybe registration or registration success. This is how the object is typically looking like. We have here type, and this is auth API login success. From this we can know, okay, this sounds like a namespace for auth API, and here this action is actually login success. But this is just a string, you can write here just foo and it will work. And here how we're creating actions. We have a special function create action, which helps us to create an action. As you can see here, we are providing a string inside. This is the name of our action, but additionally, if we need to, we can provide additional properties, and we are providing them with props. So in order to understand on the real example, let's jump back to our code, and we're here inside auth feature. And here I want to create the store folder, and inside actions.ts. Now here inside we want to create our first action, which will be register. This is why here we can write export const, and as you can see here it is login. In our case it will be register, and we are calling here create action function from NgRx store. Now here inside as a first parameter we can just provide a name, and here I want to write it like this, in square brackets auth, then space, and then register. Why I'm writing like this? Because essentially all our actions for NgRx are global, which means the whole application has the list of all the sections. This is why they are unique, which means if you are naming your action like submit, then you can't really use the same name in another feature. This is why here we're using something like namespaces. This is still just a string, but we're prefixing it with these square brackets and the name of our feature. And as I'm here now inside source app auth, so auth feature, I am writing inside auth, which actually means all actions which we are writing for auth feature, we need to prefix with auth. Now the question is, how do we trigger our action? And in order to do that, we must jump in our component, register component, and here we want to trigger on submit our registration. And in order to do that, inside our constructor, we must inject store. And this is exactly what we're getting from NgRx store. Now here, after our console log, we can write this store.dispatch, and this is exactly how we're doing it. We're dispatching our actions, and as you can see here, we must provide an action inside. In our case, it will be register that we just created inside the store. And we should not forget route brackets. As you can see here, we are getting, okay, register is a typed action, auth register. So this is exactly how you dispatch actions. So you notify NgRx that you made some changes or something happened. But when we're looking in browser, we're getting an error, no provider for store. And this is completely valid. We must register a provider for NgRx store, and we didn't do that. This is why I will jump back inside our main TS, inside source, and here we have our providers. Now here we want to add one more, which will be provide store without any parameters. And this is exactly what we must do in order to register store inside our NgRx. As you can see in browser, we are not getting any errors now. Now let's jump on our /register page and click here sign up. As you can see, we don't have any errors, which means we triggered something. But the main problem is that we don't see what we triggered because we didn't configure development tools yet in order to see all our actions. But before we will do that, I want to show you how to provide props inside our actions. So as you can see here inside our register component, we dispatched our register action. But it doesn't make a lot of sense because we want to provide our form information inside our register action. But the main problem is that we want to type it strictly. And actually our register action is something which will be related to our API call, because our register action must trigger an API call. But if we will check our endpoint here, we can see that for registration we will call /API/users with this body. And as you can see, this body is not looking like our form because we are packing all our form fields inside user property. This is why actually I want to create an additional interface exactly to define how we are sending our register request. This is why I will jump inside our auth and create here types. And here we can create a new file, register request.interface.ts. And actually this postfix request means that this is exactly the body of our request that we will provide for the API. And here I want to create an interface, register request interface. And again, for clarity, we are postfixing all our entities like component with word component, service with word service, and interface with word interface. And now, as you can see in documentation, we must create user. Here is a user, and we have inside three properties. First of all, email, it is a string, then password, it is also a string, and username is also a string. So our register request is ready. Now I want to use it inside our actions. So here we defined our action, create action register, but here now I want to provide props. And props is the only way to provide some data inside our action. But here we want to define it correctly. This is why we must define props as an object, and here we can create request, which actually means we must pass an object with the property request, and this is exactly our register request interface that we just created. What does it mean? We created an action with this name register, and this action must get as a property an object with field request, and it must be this register request interface. If we are not providing it correctly, then we will get a Typescript error. Let's check this out. Inside our components register, now this doesn't work. Why that? Because expected one argument. And I will try to write here just foo, and we will get an error. Argument of type string is not assignable to parameter of type request register request interface. And it is extremely important to write good TypeScript code because it will help us to make our application safer. So now we know, okay, in this section we must provide this register request interface for our API. This is why here we can prepare it. We are preparing here a request and we know that this is a register request interface. Now in order to get that we must create an object with property user, and here we can just set this form getRawValue, and in this case it is completely valid. Now here inside our register, I can provide an object with request property, and now we're not getting any errors, because here we defined, okay, we're really giving this request in the correct format and we don't have any errors. As you can see here, we don't have any errors anymore. So now what we need to do, we need to configure Devtools for our NgRx so we can see our action and all its props. In this video, we will install Redux Devtools, which will help us to debug NgRx store. But before we will jump on installing it, I want to show you one problem that we have. As you can see here, I opened our register page, and as you can see here, we have a link, have an account. But here it is not a link. And actually this is not clear why, because here we can see we used a router link, and typically this is how we're creating links inside Angular. And we're not getting any errors, which is super confusing. And actually this is one of the problems with standalone components. In case with router link, we're not getting any errors if we didn't inject it. This is frustrating, but in order to fix that, we must inject it inside our component. This is why here inside our imports we can add router link as a module. And this is the import which is needed to have a link. As you can see here, this is not just a text, this is now a normal link which is working. This is important to remember. If you want to enable links inside your component, you must inject router link to your component. With that being said, let's install now Redux Devtools. So why do we need it at all? As we're working with NgRx and Redux, we want to see all our actions, our state, in a comfortable ways. Also, Redux Devtools helps a lot to debug your application and even fix bugs without opening your code. You can simply trigger some actions and see how they are changing your state. So the first step that you must do, you must Google Redux Devtools and jump to Chrome extension, because what you want to install first is Redux Chrome extension. After installation, we want to jump inside NgRx to another library, and here inside Developer Tools we have NgRx Store Devtools. This is exactly what we want to install. As you can see here is the installation line, this is just an additional library. So here I want to write npm install NgRx Store Devtools. Now our package is successfully installed, so let's look in the documentation. Here inside Store Devtools we have a setup that we need to. But most importantly, inside NgRx you always have two different sections. You have a section with module approach and you have a section with standalone approach here on the bottom. As you can see, we're interested in using the standalone API because we don't have any modules. And in order to use our Redux toolkit, we must jump back inside source main.ts and here add one more provider. And here we want to create provide store devtools. And inside we must write our configuration. First of all, max age. As you can see, this is the maximum amount of actions that we are storing. We need this limitation for performance. After this, log only. And we're using log only if we're in production. This is why here we're using is not development mode. After this, it is nice to use autopause true to avoid too many actions, trace false, and trace limit 75. So essentially this configuration is how I am using Redux Devtools in all my applications. After this, in browser we must hit this Redux tab, and you are getting this tab after you successfully install this Chrome extension. And here you will get the content only if you made this configuration for your application. And here we see lots of stuff. First of all, we see here state, and we can click on it. And this is the state of our application. As you can see, we don't have any state at all because we did not create it yet. On the left here we see actions, and here we can see just a single action, NgRx store init. This is an automatic action of NgRx itself. But here on the bottom now I want to click sign up. And as you can see, voila, we are getting our action, auth register. So we must click on it, and here on the right we can debug it by clicking on action. Here we can see the type, this is the string that we are providing, and here is our request, and we can directly see all our properties that we are providing inside action. And as you can see, our action is looking exactly like we planned. We have inside a request, which is an object with user property and 3 fields: username, email, and password. So this is exactly how we want to debug our Redux actions by using Redux Devtools. In this video, I want to talk more regarding authentication interfaces. Just to remind you, we already created an interface inside app, auth, types, register request. And this is exactly our request for registration and why we created it at all. We could just throw a bunch of data in the API and it would work. But most importantly, with the interface, all developers can see what data we're writing inside, why we're doing that at all. Additionally to that, interface helps us to define what data we have. For example, here I can write just request without an interface, but it means that I can throw whatever inside this request. It is not validated in this case, but just in case with our action. But why it is being validated inside our action? Only because we specified it as an interface for our request. And we could write all these fields on the left, just here, it would work, but it will be difficult to support. This is why I highly recommend you always think about your application as a group of interfaces. You must define all your entities, the relations between these entities. This is why the next thing that I want to do is to create the interface for the current user. And here, as you can see in documentation, our registration returns for us a user, and our getCurrentUser also returns for us a user, and updateCurrentUser also returns a user, which actually means it makes a lot of sense to create an interface because it will be reusable. Now the question is where we will create it. We could essentially create all our interfaces which are related to auth inside auth types and simply reuse them everywhere. But as I already said, we want to make stuff shareable. This is why here I want to create source app shared folder, because we want to put shared stuff inside our shared folder. And here I want to create types folder, and inside new interface, current user interface TS. And here what we can do, we can jump inside our user to see all its properties. So here let's define our interface, and it is our current user interface. Don't forget a postfix. So first of all, here we're getting an email, and it is a string. After this we're getting a token. This is also a string. This is what we will use later for authentication. Then username, it is also a string. We're getting biography, it can be string or null by default. And image, it can also be string or null. So we successfully created our current user interface, and it is lying now inside app shared because we want to use it across the whole application. In this video we must talk about NgRx state, and as I already told you, NgRx state is just a global object where we have all our data. And inside our application we created a feature auth. This is why all properties which are related to authentication I want to store in a slice of this global object. How we are doing that? Inside store we are creating a new file and we can name it reducers.ts. But before we will start to write our reducer, I want to create an additional interface for our state. So I want to jump inside auth types and create here our auth state interface TS, which essentially means for every single slice of data or every single feature, we will create a slice of state. This is exactly it. So here I want to create an interface, auth state interface. And for now, we will create here just a single property is submitting boolean. Why do we need is submitting at all? Here we have the sign up button and we want to disable it at the moment when we are making an API call. And we are setting is submitting to true, and when it is finished, we are setting it back to false. And by default, it must be in false. Now let's jump back inside our store reducers. So what is reducer at all? This is just a function where inside we're defining how actions are changing our state. As you can see here in the example, we create here a reducer scoreboard and we are reacting here on different actions. In this application, we are getting an action home score, away score, reset score, set score, and so on. And here we are updating our state with new data. And additionally to that, as you can see, we are providing inside initial state. So this is how we typically create reducers inside NgRx, but we can use a little bit of sugar to make it easier and write less boilerplate. Instead of create reducer, we can use here create feature. And here inside reducer, I want to create auth feature. And we're using here a function create feature. Essentially, this is just a sugar around reducer, and you will see it in a second, but it allows us to write less code. And first of all, here we must provide a name. Typically, it will be just a string, which is the name of our feature. In our case, it will be auth. After this, we must create reducer property, and here we are writing exactly create reducer that you saw in documentation previously. And inside here, we must provide our initial state, but we don't have one yet. We must create it here on the top. So here I want to define property initial state, and here we can use our interface that we just created. This is auth state interface, and as you can see, we're directly getting an error, property submitting is missing, so we're fully covered with Typescript. We must set here default property is submitting to false. Now here inside our create reducer, we're providing initial state that we just created. And after this, we're writing a bunch of on functions. So on and something happened, then we're doing something. And just to remind you, in our case, we have just a single register action. This is why here we can write on and provide inside register. And this is our action. And here as a second parameter, we're getting access to our state and we want to update it. So what we want to do here is spread state, and update is submitting property and set it to true. Now let's talk about this code. So you already understand, we're defining here our feature with name auth. And here we're defining reducer. So here inside we're providing our initial state. This is exactly the slice of data for our auth feature. And here we're defining all possible ways to change our state. And our first action here was register. This is why we're writing here register action, and this is the function how our register action will update our state. Now here is a super important part. We can't mutate state that we're writing here. So we can't write here state.property equals something. This is wrong because inside we have Redux, and Redux and Redux Devtools are working in a way where we're always returning the new state, because this is how Redux compares our old state and new state and understands that our state was changed. Which actually means here we will always write code in such way. This construction simply returns a new state because here we returned a new object. What we're doing inside, we're spreading all properties of our state, and here we're updating just a single property is submitting. And don't worry if you are not understanding this code fully, we will write it a lot of times and you will get a grasp on it. So our feature is ready. Now I want to export some stuff from it. This is why here on the bottom I will write export const, and I want to get some properties from our auth feature. And first of all, here what we can get is a name, and essentially name is our auth name, and we want to export it to use it everywhere because this is our unique name to define this slice of state. And I want to name it auth feature key because the export name globally is not unique, but auth feature key is really unique. And I want to name all our names of the features with the name of the feature, then feature key. And after this, we want to export our reducer. It was also created automatically, but I want it with other name auth reducer. Why that? Because we want everything unique. We don't want an import reducer. This is not clear. We want to see it as auth reducer. And the last thing that we need to do, we want to register our reducer inside our project. And for this, I want to jump in source main TS. And here, for example, after provide store, we can write provide state. And inside provide state, we're writing two things. First of all, feature name. In our case, it will be auth feature key that we just get. And here will be auth reducer. And as you can see, auth feature key is just a constance auth. and auth reducer is our function that we just created. Now let's jump in browser and check our state. Here we must click in Redux Devtools on the state, and as you can see, it is not empty anymore. Here we are getting object, auth, and this is exactly this reducer, this slice of data that we created, and inside we have is submitting false. Now here I want to click sign up, and here as you can see we are getting our register action. After this you can see that our state changed, we are getting here is submitting true, which actually means after every single action we can see changes in our state. And additionally to that we can click on the difference, and it shows what this action changes exactly inside our global state. And here we are changing is submitting from false to true. And the last thing that I want to clarify is why we provided state here. And essentially we have two different ways to create our state. We either create it here by default, like auth for example, or we're creating state only when we're jumping to that specific route which needs some slice of state. For example, let's say that we have a slice for a single article. We won't have it here by default when we're on the register page, because it is needed only on our single article. And as our single article is lazy loaded, we won't have NgRx store by default there. We will register it only when we're jumping to that specific route. But it is not true about authentication, because authentication is a shareable module which we will use everywhere across every single page, because essentially every single page wants to know if we're logged in or not. This is why we're registering this feature in the main TS. In this video we want to talk about selectors. Why that? Because actually we already created actions and we created reducer for our state. Now we want somehow to get this data inside our component. And inside NgRx we're typically doing it with the help of selectors. This is why I want to jump inside app, auth, store, and here I want to create new file and call it selectors.ts. First of all, here we want to create a feature selector, so we want to get all properties of our auth feature. This is why here I will write export const select feature. And here we know that we are getting state, and this is the object with property auth, and this auth is auth state interface. And here we want to return state.auth. So essentially this state is our global state inside NgRx, and this select feature simply gets our auth slice. And now we want to create specific selector for our isSubmitting property that we already have. This is why here I will define select isSubmitting, and we're using here a function which is called createSelector, and it gets our property from the feature. This is why here the first function will be select feature, and secondly we're getting access to our state, and we can get here state.isSubmitting. And as you can see we're getting nice autocomplete. So here we created selector to select a single property from our state. How we can use it now? We can jump back inside our component, register component, and here we can get it. So I want to define here isSubmitting with $, because we are getting our data as a stream. And here I simply assign this .store select, and we want to write here select isSubmitting. This is exactly the selector that we created. But as you can see here, we are now getting an error. Property auth is missing in type empty object, and we want to get auth state interface. And it happens because here inside our store we didn't define our state. So here we can write our object with auth property, and it will be auth state interface. So now NgRx knows what properties do we have inside our global NgRx state. This is why here this line is working, and we can use isSubmitting now. So what is isSubmitting $? This is an observable of Boolean. This is not simply a Boolean, this is an observable, which actually means we can subscribe to it, and every single change that will happen in state will change this property. This is why we can jump inside HTML, and here on the top I want to simply render this property. We're writing here isSubmitting with $, and after this I want to resolve it with the usage of async. We're getting an error no pipe found with the name async, and you will get this error a lot because it means that you didn't inject common module inside your standalone component. This is why I want to jump inside our register component, and here inside imports I want to add common module. As you can see here, we are not getting an error anymore, and here on the top you can see this app running and then false. And this false is exactly this property that you can see inside state, inside auth is submitting false. What we can do now, we can click on our sign up, and this will change this property inside state to true. And as you can see here on the top, this property was also updated inside our markup, which actually means we can directly use it. And in order to do that, I can remove is submitting here and use it inside our button. So I want to write here disabled when our is submitting with $async pipe is resolved to true. As you can see, it is green. Now I'm clicking on this button and it is grayed out because is submitting is true now and it is never coming back to false. So this is exactly how selectors are working. We're creating a selector, and then in any place of our application we can select through this selector some data from the state and then use it inside our markup, because this is just an observable with some data. So this is how we're creating selectors, but I don't recommend you to write selectors at all. Why that? Because we wrote lots of code which we can omit just because NgRx is smart enough to generate for us this code. Which essentially means I showed you this just that you know how we're creating selectors, but NgRx can do it for us. Let's remove completely selectors TS and jump inside our reducers TS. And here we imported reducer, auth reducer, but now what I want to import is select, and as you can see we are getting autocomplete with two things. We can select the whole auth state and we can select is submitting property. And what I want to do, I want to re-export select is submitting. And as you can see, this is exactly the same selector that we just created, but we are getting it out of the box if we are using not just create reducer, but create feature. Because this create feature creates for us a feature key, a reducer, and a bunch of selectors for all properties that we are getting in the state. This is why we removed our selectors, but inside components we can directly use it. We don't need to import select is submitting from store selectors, but from our reducers. And it will still working as it is, because nothing is changing here. This selector is simply already there. As you can see, by default, our button is green, I am clicking and our button is grayed out. So now you know how selectors are working inside NgRx. In this video we want to talk about services. Why that? Because we are talking about register page and register request. And in order to register a user, we must make an API call with our form data. And essentially we have everything except of the service. This is why in this video let's create it. And where we will put our service. If we are talking about our auth feature, we can create a folder with services here. And for now we have just a single service which will be auth service.ts. And in order to register a service, we are using a decorator injectable. And after this we want to export our new class auth service. But it is not all. We want to provide inside injectable an object with provided in root. And this is the recommended approach from Angular to register service directly inside root of our project. In this case, it will be available everywhere. And essentially, we already created everything that we need in order to create a registration method. Inside our types, we have our register request and we have a current user. This is exactly what we need for this. This is why here I want to create a register method. But what we want to use inside is HTTP. This is why we must inject it here inside our constructor with private HTTP, and here we have HTTP client. And as you can see here on the top, HTTP client is being imported from Angular common HTTP. So our HTTP client is there, now we can create a register function. So we're getting some data inside, and this is exactly our register request interface. And just to remind you, inside our component, register component here, we have on submit, and we're dispatching here our register request with this data. Essentially, this is just an object with field user, and inside we have our form data. This is exactly what we're getting here, and back we want to get observable of our current user interface. And just to remind you, here in the documentation, we are making for registration a post request to /API/users with this data. This is exactly what we specified. No authentication required, and it returns a user. This is why here we wrote that we're returning an observable of current user. Why an observable? Because an HTTP request is always a long task and it returns for us an observable. So inside we must prepare a URL that we want to call. This is why here let's create a URL, and here we have https API realworld.io/API, and just to remind you, here it is /API/users. So here at the end we will have /users. Just to remind you, this is a public API. If for some reason you set it up your local API, then here you should not write API realworld.io, but http localhost 3000/API/users. So here we have our URL. Now here we can return this .http, and we must make a post request. And inside, first of all, we are providing our URL, and secondly, we are providing our data. But as you can see, we are getting an error because we must specify what we are getting back. If we don't specify anything, then HTTP says that we are getting back an object. But our function here says that we are getting current user interface. This is why here for the post, inside we must specify what we are getting back. And actually, we didn't create such interface yet. This is why I want to jump inside auth types. So the type that we want to create here is auth response.interface.ts. And here you might ask, okay, but why we didn't create here a register response interface? And it makes a lot of sense because in this case we have our body, which is register request interface, and our response, which is register response interface. But the main point is that all these requests like register, login, getting current user, updating current user will return for us the same response. This is why here I created it like auth response, and this is the same response that we will get back everywhere, not just for register. This is why here I want to create a new interface, and it is our auth response interface. And what we're getting inside is a property user, which is our current user interface that we already created, which means our response is just a property user, which is a current user. Now we can jump back inside our services, our service, and here we can define that we're getting back our auth response interface that we just created. But we're still getting an error here that we're getting back auth response interface and not current user. As you can see here, we define that we want to get back a current user, but auth response is an object with property user, which is a current user, which essentially means that we must transform the result to get correct data back. This is why here I will write pipe and inside map, and this is exactly what we are using to transform the data in the stream. And here we have access for our response, and I just want to return here response.user. As you can see here, response is our auth response interface and user is our current user interface. And we don't have any errors now because after we got our HTTP request, we are mapping data inside with the pipe map construction. So this is all good, but we can make it better. As you can see here, we hard coded here the base URL inside register method, which actually means we're creating a new method like login, and we also will hard code the URL there. This is not cool, and we might want to use different API URL for local development and for staging or production. This is why this should go out of here to environment variables. But unfortunately, inside Angular, environment variables files were removed, but as a lot of people were saying that they want some generator to generate them back, we have it now. This is why here we can use the command npx-p, again Angular CLI 15 ngGenerate environments. And what it does, it creates just two files for production and local development, and also updates our Angular JSON. As you can see here, what it does, it created for us two files. First of all, source environments environment.ts, and secondly, source environments environment development.ts. And also it updated Angular JSON to replace for production build this development file with production file. Now what we can do, we can move this construction to our environment variable. This is why here I want to jump back inside our source environments, environment TS, and in the both of this file, I will create an API URL and just assign there this string. So if for some reason you need later to update your URL, for example for production, you can just update it in this file and it will be automatically replaced by Angular. Now we can jump back in our service, and instead of this URL, we can now use environment variable. This is why here I can write environment.API URL, and we are concatenating it with /users. In this case, in every single method, we can use our base URL from environment and not just hardcode it. Now, the last thing that we need to do is check if our register method is working. So we can jump back in our component register, and here on submit, I want to import inside our constructor our auth service, and this is our auth service that we just created. And now here on submit, we can use this .authService.register, and we must provide inside data. And what is data? This is our request. This is why here we can just use request, and just to test it, I can write subscribe, and here we're getting some response that I want to console log. So here we will have our response that we can check. And just to remind you, we won't use our service like this, we will use it later through NgRx. This is just for testing, so we know that our service is working. As you can see, we don't have any errors. Let's jump to the browser and check if it's working. So we must jump to /register, and we are getting an error. No provider for HTTP client. And it happens because we didn't configure HTTP inside our application. We must jump inside source main TS, and here we must create one more provider, and it is provide HTTP client. And we don't need to provide anything inside for now. Let's check again. I'm jumping to /register and it works now. We're not getting any errors. Now I will type something which for sure does not exist in all three fields and hit sign up. And as you can see here, we're getting response, and this is the response from the public API. We're getting back an email, image, token, and username. And inside our network, you can see that we successfully made a request for API realworld.io /API/users. It was successful, and here is our response, which actually means our service is working just fine and we can use it. The only thing that I want to do, first of all, I want to remove this service from here because we should not use it directly. And secondly, just to remind you, when we were testing selectors, we wrote here store and inside store auth. As we are now using selectors from the feature that was generated by NgRx, we don't need to write this stuff. Even if we will remove this construction and just write store, our isSubmitting selector is still working, which actually means you can write your code like this. So you already understand part of this diagram. We have our component dispatches some action, it goes to reducer, it updates our store, and through selectors we are getting updates to all our components. This is the part of NgRx which is synchronous and it works without effects. Essentially, effects is not needed for synchronous actions inside NgRx. Effects is an additional library for NgRx in order to make, for example, API calls. Essentially, you need effects when you have some long-term side effect operation, like for example an API call. So the example of typical usage would be a registration request which takes some time. This is why we need three actions: start, success, and failure. And all these actions are still synchronous, but some of these actions are being dispatched through effect later when our service is being called inside effect. And it may sound overwhelming, this is why let's try to implement it on our own. And our first step here will be to install effects library, and we can do it with npm install NgRx effects. This is why I'm jumping in the console and I'm installing here NgRx effects. Our next step here would be to jump and change our actions. Just to remind you, inside store actions we have register action. This is not enough. For effects, we typically need 3 actions. As I already said, start, success, and failure. So our register is start. We also want to create register success and register failure. So you typically would need to copy-paste this create action 3 times and write here register success, and you are changing here string to register success, and then register failure, and here register failure. The main point is that this code can be a little bit better with some NgRx sugar. So instead of all this stuff, what we can do, we can create a group. So here I want to create a new property and call it auth actions. And here inside we will have all our authentication actions at once. And in order to do that, we are using create action group. And inside we must provide an object. First of all, we have here source, and the source is our auth. And what is this source? This is exactly this part, this namespace that we wrote in every single string. Now we don't need to do it by our own. Secondly, we want to create events, and this is also an object. And our first event here will be register. And this is exactly what we wrote previously here. So what we have here, the key register, this is this string that we wrote here, and our value is props. This is why here on the right we can just copy paste what we had here with props. So this code is exactly the same like this code. And now what we can do, we can write auth actions.register, and this is exactly the same. And when I check it here, you can see that our action creator is auth register, and inside we have our props with request. But the main point is that we are writing a little bit less, and all our actions are being organized in the same object. For example, here now we want to create our register success, but the main problem is that we must write it as a string because we want to use a space inside. And here as a value we must define what our register success will return for us. Just to remind you, we are making an API call to register a user, and back we are getting current user. This is why here we can define our props and say that we will get back our current user. Let's write current user, and this is current user interface. And here don't forget round brackets. And the last one here is our register failure. And for now we don't want to get anything back. This is why I will write here empty props. It means that we don't have any properties but just a type string. As you can see here, we wrote significantly less than we wrote here on the bottom. This is why in the whole project we will always use create action group and not create action. So here we have 3 our actions. Now we want to create an effect. So here let's create a new file which will be effects.ts, and here we want to export a new effect which will be register effect. And in order to create effect, we are using create effect function. So just from the start, I want to tell you that effects are extremely difficult to understand because they are written with Redux.js, and there are quite a lot of methods and calls inside to understand it from the first time. But we will do it again and again, and all our effects will be written super similar. This is why with time you will grasp how it works. So inside effect we are getting several properties, and here we are assigning to them some default values. First of all, here we are getting access to our actions with $, and this is the stream with all actions that are happening in our application. And here we are using word inject to inject them here, and these are actions property. The second thing that we need here is our auth service, and we need it here because we want to call our API service and register function with effect. This is why here we can write auth service, and here we want to inject our auth service that we created. Now inside our register effect we want to return actions with $.pipe, and just to remind you, we are using pipe to group all our actions. And now you must really pay attention to the round brackets. As you can see here, I have round brackets for effect, and the first argument inside this effect is a function. So all this stuff that we wrote here is the first argument. So this is a function where inside we have different parameters like actions, service, and this function is returning for us an observable. The second parameter here will be our options, and here we always have an object with functional true, because we are writing our effect in a functional way. Now we use here actions pipe because with the pipe we can throw inside several Redux.js functions which will be applied to this stream. And first of all, here we want to apply auth type. Why auth type? Because we want to limit this action stream to just actions that we need. And inside of type, what we want to provide is auth actions that we just created, dot, and here we have access to all our actions, register, register failure, register success. But here we want to react to register, which is the start of our registration process. After this, we are using switch map function, which allows us to return a new observable. And inside switch map, we are providing a function, and inside we can destructure directly our property that we are getting, which consists of type and request to get a request. Now what we want to do inside, we want to call our auth service. This is why here I am returning our auth service dot, and here we have our register function that we created previously. And inside we must provide exactly the request from our action. And here we also use pipe because we want to do some transformations. And inside pipe, first of all, we will have map because we want to map our data. And as a result of successful registration, we are getting our current user back. And this is our current user interface. And we want to return here auth actions dot register success. And we want to provide inside an object with current user. After our map, we want to catch an error. For now, we are not interested what we are getting back because our failure was empty. But later, for sure, to implement backend errors, we will use it. This is why inside catch error, what I want to do, I want to return auth, and inside we are provided auth actions dot register failure, and we are just calling it. And I know that for sure if you are seeing effects for the first time, this code is mind-blowing for you. But stay calm, you will see this code again and again. And now I just want to go through this code one more time. So what is register effect? This is some listener which listens to some action. In our case here, we're listening for action register, and when it happens somewhere inside our application, so it was dispatched, then we're doing all this stuff. In order to use here actions, we must inject them, and also the same with our service. When this register action happens, we are coming to this switch map. And what we are doing inside, we are calling our service register to make a registration call to the API. If it was successful, we are coming here to map. If it was failure, then we are coming to catch. Inside map, we are getting current user as a result, and here we are returning auth actions register success, which is our action. And you might say, okay, but why we didn't dispatch this action? And actually effect will dispatch this action for us. This is why we simply return it, and effect will call it. Inside our catch error, in order to return our request, we must wrap it with auth, and we are doing it always inside catch. Now let's check if we have some errors. I'm jumping here, and for sure we are getting errors inside our auth stored users. And here we are getting our errors from module action, and it happens because our register is not there anymore, because we used there a create action group. This is why what we must do, we must jump inside our reducers, and instead of this code we want to get auth actions that we have now, and now instead of register here we are using auth actions dot register, and this code stays exactly the same. As you can see here, we are getting exactly the same error inside our component. This is why let's jump in component register and change it also. So here on the top, I want to write auth actions from our actions. And now here on the bottom, we're dispatching auth actions dot register. As you can see now, everything is green and we can proceed. But essentially nothing will happen inside our application because we didn't register our effects. And in the same way like with auth state, we must register our effects in source main.ts. Why is that? Because this is something which must be available for us in the whole application, because we are talking about auth feature. This is why in order to do that, we must write here provide effects, and inside we are providing some effects. So what we want to do here, we want to import star as auth effects from, and here we must write path to auth store, and here we have effects. And now here inside our provide effects, we must write auth effects. And this import as a star is extremely important. If you will try to import here with destructuring, register effect and just throw it inside, it won't work. It will work only with this syntax with star as effects that we're providing inside provide effects. So this line will initialize our listener at the beginning, and now our effect will listen to our actions. Let's check this out. We don't have any errors. Let's jump inside browser and check our application. So what I want to do here, I want to open our Redux because we want to see our actions. I am now hitting sign up, and as you can see here, we are getting not just register action, but also register failure action. And it happens because our effect did an API call, and we are getting some warnings because I didn't provide any data, and this is our HTTP call where we are getting that email can't be blank. So essentially, effects now are using our service to make an API call and then dispatch some action later for us. And now let's check if success is also working. Here I want to provide some username which does not exist and some email which does not exist, and also some password. I'm hitting here sign up, and as you can see, we're getting register and register success, which is exactly what we wanted because we're making an API call, it was successful, and our effect dispatched for us a register success. In this video, we must make some updates to our NgRx store inside auth. Why that? First of all, as I already said, we will get backend errors when we're just making a request and we're getting an error back. As you can see here, when we're getting an error, it is 422 request, you can see it here, and inside preview we're getting our errors inside the object with fields like email can't be blank. So what I want to do now, I want to create an interface for our backend errors, and I can say even more, we will get backend errors in exactly the same format for all creation of entities, like for example creating of the article or logging a user. This is why we must go inside our project, source app, shared, types, and here I want to create backend errors.interface.ts. Now inside we want to create an interface, and it will be our backend errors interface. And what it is, this is just an object with some keys. We don't know exactly what these keys are, but we know they are strings. And then as you can see here, the values are an array of strings. This is why here it will be key string, and the value here will be array of string. This is exactly what you can see here, but without this errors property, because we want to store backend errors without it. Our next step here is to update our action, because as you remember inside auth store actions, we didn't tell what we're getting inside failure action. We're getting here empty props, and this is not correct. Actually, we want to get here back our validation errors. This is why here let's say that we're getting backend errors, and this is our backend errors interface that we just created, which actually means we can remove empty props here on the top. Additionally to that, I want to update our state inside reducer. We must jump inside types, auth state, and for now we have just is submitting property, and it is not enough. When we are getting successfully a user, we want to store it inside. This is why here we can write current user, and it is our current user interface that we already have, but by default it will be null or undefined, and we must talk about it. Why I'm writing here it like this? At the beginning we don't have user at all, this is why we will set it to undefined. But then after we will make an API call to know if we are logged in or not, we either get back a current user interface or we don't get anything back and we know that we are not logged in. This is why we want to distinguish between we didn't make a request yet, this is undefined, and we already made a request but we didn't get a user back, and then it will be null. This is why we have 3 states here and not 2. Also here we need is loading property, and essentially we will need it later when we will have getting of the user. And the last one here is validation errors, and this is exactly backend errors that we just created an interface for, and we want to store them inside state so we can render them inside component. So what is validation errors? This is either our backend errors interface or null. Why null? Because by default we will set it to null as we don't have any validation errors. And now we must update our reducer. Let's jump inside store, reducers, and first of all, as you can see here, our initial state is not correct. We're missing here is loading, which we can set with false, current user, and by default it will be undefined, and validation errors, it will be null. Now, just to remind you, here we have just a single on section which reacts on register. And what is register? This is starting of our API call to make a register request. And here we are changing our state to is submitting true. This is totally fine, but I want to add here also validation errors now. Why that? Because essentially when we have some validation errors and we're rendering them, and after this we're clicking submit, we want to remove them completely, so they will be null, and then later we will fill them with new validation errors. Now we must write exactly the same on, but for our success when we're getting current user. This is why I will copy paste fully this on and just change it. Here we want to react on auth actions dot register success, and we're not getting here only a state, which is our current state, but also an action. And inside our action, just to remind you, you can see here we're getting register success and we're getting inside our current user. This is why here what we want to do, we want to set our is submitting back to false, and our current user that we have, we want to set inside, and this is action dot current user. Which actually means when we successfully registered, we're setting is submitting to false and current user inside our current user property. Now let's do the same with our register failure. This is why I will copy paste this code again. We also need an action here, and we want to set it submitting to false. This is totally fine. Here must be register failure, and here we want to save our validation errors, and we will get them from action.errors that we already defined, and this is our backend errors interface. Additionally to that, we can improve our exports. Here we are just exporting is submitting, but we can also select here is loading, select current user, and select validation errors. All this stuff we will use later in different components. And last but not least, we have an error. As you can see here, we are getting an error inside our effect, because we did not provide anything inside register failure, and this is wrong. Our register failure action wants to get back an errors property. This is why we must go inside effects, and as you can see here inside Cachero, we are getting an error. So what we must do here, we must get an error response. This is exactly what we are getting from the backend. And this is HTTP error response. And here inside register failure, we want to set errors property, and it will be error response dot error dot errors. And this dot errors is exactly that key that you saw in backend validation when we're making an API call. Let's check if it's working. Here what I want to do is jump inside our Redux. This is our only source of check. And what I want to do here, I want just to sign up. First of all, as you can see here, our sign up is not disabled anymore. And it happens because here register failure happened. And what it does, here you can see the diff, we changed is submitting from true to false, and we added here our validation errors with email can't be blank. This is why here inside our state now we have is submitting false, is loading false, and we're getting here our validation errors, where inside we have just an email with array can't be blank. Now let's try to register user correctly. So here we are providing username, then email that does not exist, and some password. I'm hitting here sign up, and we're getting register and register success. And as you can see, after register success, we filled our property current user. And now inside we have all needed information that we can use later across the whole application. In this video we must implement our backend error messages, so how we can do that? I'm sorry for interruption, but I just want to let you know that I have a membership here on the channel that you can join to support me. It will give you access to the new videos earlier, emojis, and priority replies to your comments. Just to remind you, here on the top of our form, we want to display our backend error messages. And we already saved them to our NgRx, so we can render them now. But first of all, how we can get them inside our component? We can jump inside our register component, and you already know how to do that. We wrote here is submitting line like this to select is submitting. we can just copy paste it and write here backend errors with $, and select here not select is submitting but select validation errors. After this we can simply get backend errors with async and render them inside our component. But just imagine if you have here not 2 properties, but you are selecting like 10 or 20 of them. Then you are writing 20 lines of code and you must create 20 different properties. And it is even worse inside your HTML because you have everywhere these async pipes that you are using for different things. This is why it makes a lot of sense to group all these selects with combine latest, and it helps tremendously to scale your code indefinitely. This is why what we want to do here, we want to create a new data property with $, and we assign here combine latest. And if you don't know what combine latest does, it simply resolves every single stream with the value, which actually means we will have every single value from every single observable inside this data property directly like a local property. And you will see it in a second. First of all, here I want to define key is submitting. And here what we want to do, we want to paste this select that we wrote here before. After this, we want to define here backend errors, and here we want to assign this select validation errors. And now we don't need is submitting and backend errors at all, because we are storing everything inside data $. And as you can see here, we are getting our data. This is an observable of the object with this submitting, which is boolean, and backend errors, which is backend error interface or null. And now we can easily use it inside our HTML. Here I want to jump in our HTML and I want to wrap the whole project within ng container. And actually this is exactly what we will do in every single component. We're writing here ngIf, and here we're resolving data $, with a sync pipe, and we're using keyword as data. And what it does for this whole ng container block, it will create a local property data, which is our object. And this is exactly the local property which is being resolved from our observable, which actually means we're writing just a single async pipe for the whole component. We won't have like hundreds of them. And just to remind you, here on the bottom we wrote is submitting $async. We don't need to do that anymore. We can simply write here data dot is submitting, and this is it. This is just a local property of data. The same stuff is going with backend errors. Here what I want to do, I want to create an additional component which will render backend errors, because we want to render them in different places, and it is for sure shareable. This is why here we can create MC backend error messages, and let's close it here. It is MC backend error messages. So first of all, here we want to render this component only when our backend error messages are there, which actually means they are not null. This is why we must write here ngIf and check for data.backend errors. And if we have them, then we want to pass them inside. This is why here I want to create an input backend errors, and this is data.backend errors. You can already see how easy we can use combine latest with async pipe to use all our observables as a local property. Now let's create our shareable error messages component. So I will copy paste this selector and jump inside source app shared, and we don't have here components yet. This is why here we are creating components, and here we will have all our shareable components. And our first component here will be backend error messages. And inside we will create two files, backend error messages.component.ts and backend error messages.component.html. Now let's jump to the TS file and create our component. And here, first of all, we must provide here the selector that we just created. It is MC backend error messages, and after this template URL, it will be backend error messages component HTML. And we should not forget that all our components are standalone. This is why we are providing standalone true. Now here let's export our new class, which will be backend error messages. And inside this class, as you already saw, we are getting our backend error messages. This is why here we must define an input, and we are getting backend errors. And what is backend errors? This is backend errors interface that we created previously. But here is the huge problem. We're getting an error that property backend errors has no initializer and is not definitely assigned. And essentially this is correct because this component can't really know if we provided some data to it or not, which actually means this component is error prone. It will break if we didn't provide backend errors. But here is an easy fix. We can simply assign here as default value an empty object, which actually means it won't break if we don't provide inside errors. Now what I want to do, I want to convert our object with errors to the readable format. Now we have an object with keys like, for example, email, and as a value we have an array with some errors like foo or bar. This is not comfortable to render. This is why we want to convert this stuff to array with different strings. For example, here will be email and then the error message, for example, foo space bar. Then we will have an error, for example, for username, then here will be username and some error regarding username. In this case, it is much easier to render, and this is exactly what user wants to see on the screen. This is why in order to do that, we must convert these backend errors. This is why here I want to create error messages, and this is exactly what we want to create. This is an array of strings, and by default it is an empty array. Now here we can implement on init, where inside we will make this conversion. So here is ng on init, and we want to create our error messages. This is why we want to set inside these error messages object keys. And what is object keys? This is every single property that we are getting, like for example email, username or password. And here we are getting keys of these .backend errors. And we want to map through every single key and get access to the name, and our name is a string. Now inside we want to join all our messages. This is why here let's create a new property messages and just read this backend errors name, and it will give us back an array of strings, and here we just want to make a join with a space. So our messages, as you can see here, is just a string. Now here we want to return our name, this is our field, space, and then our messages. In this case, inside error messages, we're getting an array of strings. Now let's render our error messages. We must jump inside HTML and simply create here UL with class error-messages, and let's close this UL, and inside we have a li where we want to have a loop. This is by ng4, and we're looping to get an error message of our error messages that we just created. And error message is just a string. This is why we can simply render it on the screen. Let's check if we have any errors. Here, as you can see, we are getting them because MC backend error messages is not a known element inside register component. This is why we must jump back to our app, auth, components, register component, and here inside import we want to add our backend error messages that we just created, and this is our component. Additionally to that, as you can see, I have several imports which are not being used, and I can remove them. As you can see now, we are getting an error regarding ng4. We used ng4 loop, but we didn't import common module inside our backend messages component. This is why we must jump back to our backend messages component, and here we must make an import. And inside import we are providing our common module. As you can see now, everything is green and we don't have any errors. Now let's click sign up and not fill anything. And as you can see here on the top, email can't be blank was rendered. And this is exactly our backend error messages because we read them from the state. And just to remind you, inside Redux we have the state, and now inside our state we have this validation errors. Then we converted this object to an array of strings and we rendered them here on the top. Now we just need to remove this string backend error messages. We don't need it anymore. So here I am removing backend error messages, and now our backend errors are rendered there. In this video we want to save our token inside local storage. What I am even talking about? When we are making a register or login request, we are getting back a token, and we can easily see it inside our interface. Inside types, auth response, we are getting back a current user interface. And inside here we have such string which is called token. The main point is that after we logged in, between page reloads, we want to be logged in. How we can do that? we must save our token, for example, to local storage, and then every single time when we're reloading the page and we're making new request, we must attach this token to headers, which actually means every single time when backend gets our API call, it knows to which user our request belongs, and then it understands, okay, we really can get this feed, for example, or we can create this article, which actually means the goal of this video is to store this token after we got it from the backend, so we can reuse it later. And now you might ask, okay, what is the best place to do that? And you should never do this inside reducers. Just to remind you, our reducers is just changing of the state, which is pure. We don't have any side effects here, and we should never make here some API calls or local storage usage and so on. We must do all our side effects inside effects. This is why we have effects. And here we have our register effect, and as you can see here, we're returning our register success, which actually means directly here, before we return register success, we can set our token to local storage. And essentially we could just write here window.localstorage.setItem, and here we want to set it to access token, and as a value here we can provide current user.token. This is already enough. But this is not really reusable, and this is why I want to create a shareable service, which will be a persistent service that we can use across the whole application, and it can work correctly with local storage even if we have some objects or some invalid data. This is why here let's remove this line and create this persistent storage. And as this service will be shareable and we can use it in different places to work with local storage, I want to create it inside app, shared, and here I want to create services. And inside here we want a new file, persistence.service.ts. And here inside, as always, we must provide an injectable, and inside we want to add provided in root. Now here we must export our class, which is persistence service. And inside our class we need two methods, set and get, but we want to write try catch in each of them so they are bulletproof. So here is our set, and typically we have a key, which is a string, and we have some data, and our data is unknown. And we could essentially write here any, but any is not that good. In this case, we don't know what data we are talking about. This is why we are writing here unknown, and it will return void. Now here we want to wrap our code with try and catch. And if we're catching an error, we can simply log it inside. This is why here console error saving to local storage. And here we want to see this error. And inside try we want to set it by using local storage.setItem, and here we are providing a key, and as a value we want to use JSON stringify and data. Why we are doing that? Because sometimes our data can be an object, a string, a number. We want to stringify it because in local storage we can save only strings. So our set method is ready. Now let's create get method. So here is get, and we are getting typically something by a key. And here back we are getting unknown. And inside we are doing just the same stuff. We have try and we have catch, and here we want to catch an error. And if we have an error, then we can write console error getting from local storage. And inside our try we want first of all to get a local storage item. This is why here I will create a property local storage item, and it is local storage.getItem by the key that we provided. And after this we want to check, okay, do we have a local storage item? If yes, then we want to parse it. So here I will use JSON parse, and I'm providing inside our local storage item. In other case I am returning null. And you might ask, okay, why I created this additional property? Because essentially we must check if we have local storage item, and if we don't, then we don't need to apply JSON parse, but we simply return null. And as you can see here, we are getting a warning that not all code paths return a value. This is why here inside catch we must write return null. In this case, if we are getting an error, we will still get a null back and our code won't break. Now let's use this persistent service inside our effect. So I'm jumping back to store effects, and now here we must inject it. And in order to do that, we just write comma persistence service equals, and here will be inject, and we're writing our persistent service that we just created. Now inside our map we can write persistent service.set, and our key will be access token, and our data will be current user.token. And now exactly like this we can reuse persistent service across the whole application, and it is bulletproof. Let's check if we have any errors. Everything is green. Let's jump to the browser and try to register user correctly. So here is a username, then some email, and then password. I'm hitting here sign up, and we're getting successful registration. Now here we must jump to application, and here local storage, and as you can see our access token was set to the local storage, and now after page reload it is still set there and we can reuse it. And the last thing that we're missing is redirect to the home page after successful registration, and we can do it directly inside our effect. So what we want to write here is one more effect. This is why here I want to export const, and here will be redirect after register effect, and here we want to create effect just like we did previously. So here we have our function, and as a second parameter we're providing functional true, but also dispatch false. And this dispatch false is important in this case. Why is that? Because we don't want this effect to dispatch anything. Just to remind you, here we returned register success and it was dispatched automatically. But here we just want to make a redirect, we don't need to dispatch anything. So here inside round brackets we want to get access to our actions, and here as previously we are using inject actions to get access to them. After this we also need access to our router, because we will use router to make a redirect. And here I will inject router, and inside we want to return our stream. This is by here actions pipe, and here just like before we want auth type, and we are waiting here for success. This is by auth actions.register success, and after this we are using tab. And if you don't know what is tab inside stream, it simply means make me something. This is kind of side effect inside the stream, and here inside tab we can create a function which will make a router navigation. So router dot, and here will be navigate by URL, and we're providing inside slash, which is our home URL. And as you can see here, I'm getting an error, cannot find name router, and it happens because here I didn't put equal sign, but just colon. So now we're not getting any errors, and what this effect does, it listens for register success, and when it happens, it makes redirect to the home page. And just to remind you, this effect will be auto-registered. Why is that? Because inside our source main, we imported all our auth effects here, and we provided them inside provide effects. This is why they all are registered out of the box. Let's jump in browser and try to register again. I'm providing user, email, and password, and I'm hitting sign up. And as you can see, username is already taken. Let's try again, and we're being redirected to the home page, which means our effect is working correctly. And this was the end of the first chapter. If you want to dive deeper in learning Angular and NgRx, make sure to check the full course in the description box below.